The United States says that they will provide long-range weapons to the country. It comes days after Joe Biden said that the US would not give Ukraine weapons that could strike inside Russia. Kyiv has been asking the US and other NATO members for long-range missiles so that it can combat Russia's advance in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russian forces are focusing on the east of Ukraine, and in the last few days, fighting has intensified in the city of Severodonetsk. Lord Peter Ricketts is the Vice Chair of RUSI, a former ambassador, and was Britain's first national security advisor. He joins me now. Welcome back to the programme, Peter.
Hi, very good to be back.
Hi, thank you. How concerned should Ukraine be about the situation in Severodonetsk? I mean, this region is of real strategic importance, but, we've been waiting for the Russians to move on this area really since the war began, for them to move conclusively, haven't we?
Yes, they seem to have more or less given up the idea of occupying the whole of Ukraine. Now they're focusing all their effort in this Donbas region in the east, and this city is, as you say, a strategic point there. I mean, their policy seems not to try to occupy these places, but simply to smash them to pieces, destroy them. And we saw that with Mariupol as well, to the point where there's almost no human life left, and any remaining citizens are taken back to Russia. And that's what they seem to be doing here as well, really a slash and burn policy. And I think it shows that Putin's aim now is to conquer the Donbas, the east, and then perhaps call a halt, at least for a time, and give up any idea of being able to occupy the whole country. I mean, it's a terrible prospect for Ukraine, but it does mean that a large amount of the country will stay independent, with hopes for the future.
You say that as though, first of all, the Russian win is unquestionable, but also, Keir Giles from Chatham House has said a quick end to the conflict appeared to be the priority for France and Germany. I wonder how much there's pressure on Ukraine now, for that to be the best solution at the moment. The best solution is, the Russians take the Donbas and Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine stays intact. Is that a good policy for countries that were previously very vocal in supporting Ukraine's, battle for freedom? Is it healthy to be turning it around to that sort of philosophy now?
No, I mean, I think it's a terrible outcome for Ukraine and for Europe to see Russia being able to do that. And it may not be possible for them to do that, of course, but they seem to have concentrated massive force in that area. And it's hard to see that the Ukrainians can push them out altogether. So I don't think that Europe should at all be putting pressure on Zelensky as to what kind of settlement he might in the end be prepared to go for. We mustn't try to fight this to the last Ukrainian. We must leave the president the opportunity to set whatever parameters he thinks are possible. What I really fear is that Putin will try and occupy a large part of the Donbass. Zelensky will find it extremely hard to concede that in any formal way. I mean, he thinks rightly that in many ways he's won this war. So I think the most likely outcome is a kind of hostile stalemate, with this settling down into a stagnation, where the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, glare at each other across some sort of zone of separation. And the conflict is not over. That, I think, is a really likely outcome and a pretty worrying one for Ukraine and for Europe.
Do you see it as inevitable that Russia takes the Donbas? Is there anything, I mean, we've been talking about these long range missiles and so on. Is there anything that could stop Russia achieving that goal, bar, full on NATO intervention, which we know isn't going to happen?
No, that's not going to happen, I don't think. And these latest American missiles, rockets, will help because it'll be able to enable the Ukrainian forces to strike the Russians at greater distance, outpace them, if you like. I mean, remember that Russia occupied a part of the Donbass from 2014 and was sitting there in occupation of that before they launched this terrible war. It may be possible to push them back to that kind of line where they started from in February. I think it's quite unlikely that the Ukrainians will be able to push them all the way out, including all the way out of Crimea, which they've turned into a real fortress. So I fear that something short of full Russian withdrawal is going to be where this thing stagnates. I don't think that that's something that Zelensky will want to sign up to as a formal arrangement. That's why I think we're heading for another frozen, or at least not actively intense conflict in Ukraine in the middle of Europe, with the prospect of the West therefore having to support Ukraine economically and militarily for quite a long time to come.
And is that why you say that the idea of them glaring at each other over this borderline newly created borderline, is that why you say that that's particularly bad for Europe?
Yes, because I think it leaves another potential flashpoint. It could always be stirred up again by the Russians in the future. It leaves Ukraine very weakened and its economy not able to operate to full capacity, especially if Russia continues to occupy some of those ports on the Black Sea, and therefore very much dependent on Western economic and military help in the medium term. And it does mean that Putin has, can at least feel he's got something out of this barbaric unprovoked attack on Ukraine. So I think for NATO, it means that this issue then is the absolute strategic focus for the future. And it's going to mean a considerable effort by the West to sustain Ukraine. It's not a stable situation. It's very much what Russia got to in Georgia, where years after, 15 years after they occupied part of Georgia, there is still an unsettled conflict going on in Georgia.
The Pope has said, meanwhile, there's other fallout, isn't there, aside from the actual battling itself? The Pope has said that wheat should not be used as a weapon of war. And many listeners here at Times Radio have asked why NATO hasn't moved to protect the Black Sea port of Odessa, given that the Black Sea is international waters for a start, but also, vital to the exporting of grain that, some countries, particularly in the developing world, are heavily, heavily reliant on.
And I absolutely understand those questions. And with something like 250 million people facing hunger or famine, we're told, in the poorer countries, it's a real urgency to get those ports open and the wheat flowing again. It's disgraceful that the wheat should be used as some sort of instrument of pressure on the rest of the world. The reason NATO hasn't set up an operation to open the ports is that that would mean potentially a direct conflict between NATO and Russia at sea. And so far, NATO leaders have said, I think rightly in my view, that we shouldn't expand this into an outright war with Russia. Short of that, there has to be some kind of an agreement with Russia that they will allow wheat exports from these ports. And that's why I think some degree of talking to Putin, which is what Macron and Scholz in Germany are doing, is right, because at the end of the day, if we're going to get the wheat out of the ports, it will need some kind of acquiescence from the Russians if we are not going to go into an all-out conflict, which I don't think we are.
Can Britain be a part of those conversations? You mentioned Macron, or have we been too belligerent? Are we out of the dialogue circle now?
I think we are. Actually, we've been out of the dialogue circle ever since the 2014 invasion, where the Russians and the Ukrainians talked to the French and the Germans in something called the Minsk process. Britain stayed out of that, as did America. We've really stacked all our effort on supporting Ukraine. I think the government have done very well in that. And others, like the French and Germans, have kept the line open to Putin. I don't think now we can do that. But I would not be one of those who criticize the French and the Germans for keeping a line open. I don't think they're trying to appease Putin. I think they're trying to find a way of, for example, negotiating humanitarian access and access to the ports. And that, in the end, that needs to be done. But no, Britain and America have chosen their side on this, I think. And I don't think that either that we would want to talk to the Russians in these circumstances or that they would want to talk to us.
Indeed, but would we have done better to keep that line open?
Well, the huge division between Britain and Russia goes back a long way. It goes right back to the poisoning of poor Mr. Litvinenko in 2006 in London, and then, of course, the Skripal poisoning. All that really made it impossible for Britain to have a proper dialogue with Russia. So I think it was inevitable that our relationship with Russia was in the deep freeze in a way that it perhaps wasn't with the French and the Germans. And therefore, I think it's good that some European countries are able to keep that dialogue going. But I think with Britain and Russia, things are very, very broken and are likely to stay that way.
Lord Ricketts, thank you very much indeed for joining me.